All right, today we get to talk about the most violent and also the most significant event in all of American history, the American Civil War. Now, this is probably something you've learned about most years of high school, especially here in Mississippi. We talk about it a lot. Most grades learn it in some fashion to some extent during their history curriculum. Today, we're just going to spend one day on it because I know you guys already know a lot about it. We're going to hit the basics. Since this is world history, we're not going to dig too much deep into it. But we will cover the basics of it today. All right. So the first thing we got to talk about is the issue of slavery. All right. So in the United States, we've talked about slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, how slavery grew in the United States. Remember talking about Eli Whitney and the higher life expectancy for slaves, etc. And in 1860, for 50 years at this point, at least 50 years, slavery had been the most controversial issue in America, and it wasn't even close. Nothing else was nearly this controversial. All northern states had abolished slavery by 1860. If you see on the map there, all the areas in the light brown had abolished slavery by 1860, and all southern states were still very passionately holding on to it. And the reason for that was because the Southern economy was entirely based on slavery. That was the foundation of the South's agrarian economy, based on agriculture, mostly on cotton. Now, Congress had really been pushing this problem down the road since the beginning, and every president, every Congress had really been procrastinating the issue, just saying, we'll deal with it later, we'll deal with it later. And by 1860, it became clear that slavery really had to be addressed and decided upon. It could not be procrastinated about anymore. We had to address this issue. And there were a lot of reasons why the issue of slavery had to be dealt with by 1860. One reason is because westward expansion was accelerating. And by westward expansion, I mean settling in the territory west of the Mississippi, especially, but in this territory on the map here, all the way out to the west coast. That was accelerating at this time. Remember, this is after the Mexican War, where all this territory right here in the Southwest was acquired. This is after the Oregon Treaty, where all of this territory in the Northwest was acquired. And there was this big issue. Will the West have slavery or not? Because the North did not and the South did. And for decades, the U.S. had been trying to keep an even balance between the number of slave states and the number of free states in the country. For example, whenever one state was incorporated into the Union, another state had to be incorporated too, one being a slave state and one being a free state, in order to keep that balance between slave states and free states in the U.S. But with westward expansion accelerating, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this balance, even with boundaries like the Mason-Dixon line, which is right here on the map, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and then an even more important dividing line, the 3630, which is right here, okay, this dividing line right here. So with like the Missouri Compromise, with James Monroe and several other things, we tried to keep a balance of the slave and free states, but with westward expansion, it became less and less possible to do so. Another reason why slavery really had to be dealt with by 1860 is that the federal government had gotten much larger over the past 40 years, starting with Andrew Jackson. Remember, he expanded executive power, and this issue of states' rights, which is addressed in the 10th Amendment, had become a very heated debate with regard to slavery. No state wants their rights taken away, whether they're liberal or conservative, slaveholding, free state, doesn't matter. Every state wants their rights protected. And so the concept of states' rights had become a very heated debate, specifically a state's right to choose whether or not to have slavery. And another reason why slavery was really had to be dealt with and couldn't be pushed off any longer by 1860 was that the abolitionist movement had grown so much. Remember talking about Frederick Douglass, and the abolitionist movement had really grown. And there was more and more bloodshed, more riots occurring every single year. Not all abolitionists were peaceful. Not all people who wanted to end slavery were peaceful. Some of them, for example, John Brown, would outright murder slaveholders. He would invade their plantations, find them, and hack them to death with a hatchet or a machete. It was really brutal. And that's what some of the abolitionist movement was. There was an event called Bleeding Kansas, where on the border of Kansas and Missouri, tons of bloodshed over abolitionists and slaveholders. So, this increasing violence against fellow Americans really could not continue in a united country. Something had to be done, or else the country would be ripped apart. Now, by 1860, both Northerners and Southerners really felt their rights being violated. The way that Northerners saw their rights being violated was with something called the Fugitive Slave Law. So, this law required Northerners who opposed slavery, for the most part, it required them to arrest and report slaves who had escaped captivity and fled to the north. Right. So, let's say a slave escapes from a plantation here in South Carolina and goes all the way up here to Pennsylvania, and now he's free because he's in a free state. Well, the fugitive slave law said that, hey, if you lived in Pennsylvania up here and you found a runaway slave who's now free in your territory, you have to arrest him. You have to report him so that he can be brought back down to his plantation in South Carolina. Now, this was seen as a violation of the rights of Northerners because they didn't like slavery and they felt that they should not have to aid and abet slave owners. And this whole concept that slavery should be abolished in every state instead of the states that choose it, this was also seen as a violation of the rights of Southerners. Southerners saw their rights being stepped upon because they didn't think it was the right of the federal government to tell them whether or not they could own slaves. And then, meanwhile, while most white Northerners and Southerners felt oppressed, as if their rights were being violated. Of course, the group that's being oppressed the most is obviously slaves, okay, black slaves. So really everyone was either oppressed or at least felt that they were oppressed by 1860. So very hostile environment, not a healthy environment for a country to survive in at all. Now remember, the Democratic Party was founded in 1828. It was founded around Andrew Jackson, and then the Whig Party was formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson. And then later on came the Republican Party. So the Republican Party was founded in 1854 on the platform of abolishing slavery. That's where a lot of both conservatives and liberals got together who opposed slavery and said we need an entire political party to focus on abolition, to focus on stopping the expansion of slavery and then getting rid of it entirely in every single state. So that was in 1854 that the Republican Party founded on the concept of free labor and anti-slavery. Then in 1860, 6 years later, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected. Now, when the election of Abraham Lincoln was decided, okay, once the votes were cast and it was declared that he won the election of 1860, Southerners went berserk. Okay, they absolutely went nuts. They could not accept the idea of this abolitionist Republican being their president. Okay, so this scared white Southerners because they felt that the election of a Republican would lead to the swift abolition of slavery in every single state. And the reason why they were scared of that is because it would ruin their economy and their way of life. Because remember, the entire Southern economy was based on slavery. It was propped up on that. That was the foundation of the Southern economy. So white Southerners said, hey, if this guy Lincoln gets his way, our entire economy is going to be destroyed. All right, so there are all sorts of riots, people saying he's not a legitimate president, he's not their president, people would chant. And there was a time, there were several times where, as you see in the picture up above, that's a dramatization, but they would dress up scarecrows in top hats and beards and coats to make them look like Abraham Lincoln and throw them into fires, basically saying that we want to kill this guy. So they rebelled against Lincoln's election, and this led to the Civil War. With Lincoln's election, Southerners felt that their rights were about to be taken away, as they interpreted it, and that slavery was about to go. So that is why the South seceded from the Union. The Confederate States of America formed in December of 1860. That's when the first state, South Carolina, took the first step and formally seceded, which means to break apart from the Union. They say we are no longer a part of the United States of America. We are our own country, and we're going to create the Confederacy. So this meant that they broke apart from the U.S., created their own country, the Confederacy. And after South Carolina, 10 other states very quickly followed suit. So all those states in the red on that map there, those were the Confederate States, called themselves their own country, and were separated from the Union. A guy named Jefferson Davis was made the president of the Confederacy. He was actually from Mississippi. Still today in Mississippi, there is a Jefferson Davis County named after him, and in Biloxi, there is a presidential museum of his 4 years as the president of the Confederacy. And the capital was made in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so right up here, Richmond, Virginia, that was the capital of the Confederacy. It was going to be in Montgomery, Alabama, but they chose to move it to Richmond to convince Virginia to break apart from the Union as well with the rest of the southern states. Okay, so after the Southern secession, President Lincoln declared war on the Confederacy, declared them to be an open rebellion. He said, "We do not recognize the Confederate States of America as a separate country. You are states within the United States still. You're just in rebellion, and you need to be reincorporated into our country." So the people who led each army, okay, both very skilled generals, first was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was not a supporter of slavery, but he was very loyal to his home state of Virginia. So he said, even though this war is at least part or mostly about slavery, if not entirely, he still supported the Confederacy and fought for them because he was loyal to Virginia. And he was made the commander of the Confederate Army. Now, the Union was not so lucky in finding a really good general really fast at the beginning. In fact, the Union went through about a dozen generals in the first 2 years of the Civil War. Lincoln could not find one that he liked, could not find a competent general. They were all not very successful, okay? And finally, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant, and this was after the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which we'll get to in a second. This really impressed President Lincoln, and he made Ulysses S. Grant the general of the Union, and he was for the second half of the war, and later on he himself became president. Now, both Lee and Grant were brilliant, both incredible generals, very intelligent, and Grant was determined to wear down the enemy. No matter how many Union soldiers had to die in the process. He said, you know what, the war is terrible, but if it costs 1,000,000 lives, then it costs 1,000,000 lives. We have to win this war, and eventually that's how he won. So each side had advantages when the war began. The Union had certain advantages. For example, the North had a much larger population, about double the population of the South. The North was also much richer and more industrialized, which means they had more railroads. They had about double the number of railroads that the Confederacy did. So that meant that they could transport troops and supplies with much more ease and efficiency. But the Confederacy, the South had much better military leaders, and they were also fighting mostly in their own territory, so they had kind of home field advantage. So you see here, both sides had both advantages and disadvantages when the war began. Now, two terms we have to know before we get talking about individual battles: the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. Okay, so when we talk about the Eastern Theater, that is the fighting that happened in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Okay, so we draw a line right here, okay, to the right of that line, all of those battles, that is what we call the fighting of the Eastern Theater. And then to the left of it, to the west of it, that is what we call the fighting in the Western Theater. Okay, that's the fighting that happened in Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, okay, the fighting that happened to the west of that line. So we're going to go over several major battles of the war, and then we'll talk about the effects of the war on a large scale. So the first battle of the war was the Battle of Fort Sumter. That was in April of 1861. That is when the war officially began. The first shots of the war were fired here in South Carolina, and the South won this very minor battle, and it caused Southerners to be very positive about their chances in this war. There was a lot of morale behind the Southern cause, and they felt very confident that they would win this war. Many Southerners saw this as their second war of independence, the first being the American Revolution. The first major battle of the war, okay, the Fort Sumter was a minor battle. The first major battle of the war was the First Battle of Bull Run. It's also known as the Battle of Manassas because it was fought in Manassas, Virginia, and the South also won this battle. One person that was seen as the hero of this battle for the South was a guy named Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known as Stonewall Jackson. During this battle, he earned the name Stonewall because he and his troops would not give up an inch of ground, and people said that they were like a stone wall that could not be moved. So at this point, the North realized that this war was not going to be won easily. It was going to be a very long haul. It was going to take a long time. It was going to take a lot of lives, a lot of money, and would not be easy. And then came the Battle of Shiloh. Now, this was the first major Union victory of the war. This took place in the Western Theater. Okay, this took place in Western Tennessee, actually only about 4 hours from here, from Brandon, Mississippi. And this was also the first major battle in the Western Theater. Okay, both Fort Sumter and Bull Run were in the Eastern Theater, and this battle was huge. Okay, 1862 saw some real bloodbaths. Okay, some massive casualties, and during this battle, the Battle of Shiloh, over 20,000 people were killed or wounded. 20,000 people. That's almost the size of the city of Brandon. Shortly after that was the Battle of Antietam. Now, this was the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. There have been certain battles that are bloodier, but a lot of times battles take place over the course of more than one day. But this battle took place just within the course of a few short hours, and during those few hours, over 22,000 people were killed or wounded. 22,000. This took place in Sharpsburg, Maryland, and it was a Union victory as well. The Southern troops were stopped in Sharpsburg, Maryland, and they were pushed back into Virginia. Later on that year, in 1862, around Christmas, came the Battle of Fredericksburg in Virginia, and this was also a Confederate victory. All right, so you see the pendulum swinging back and forth. Okay, you have Fort Sumter and Bull Run; those were Confederate victories. Then it swings this way, and you have Shiloh and Antietam, both being Union victories, and then it swings again to Fredericksburg, which was also a Confederate victory in Virginia. And then halfway through the war, on January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln signed a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. I mentioned this when we were talking about Queen Victoria and why she didn't get involved in the war, and this was a big reason because of the Emancipation Proclamation. So what President Lincoln did with this document is he proclaimed that the slaves in the Confederacy were now free. Now, of course, the Confederacy rejected this order because they were not under Lincoln's control. They considered themselves to be their own separate country. So they're saying, we're not going to abide by this, just like we wouldn't abide by the president of Mexico saying that our slaves are free. They said it's not up to Lincoln, it's up to them. So they rejected the Emancipation Proclamation. So really, it did not free any slaves. However, it was very important because of what it proclaimed to the world. It proclaimed to the rest of the world that the Civil War was at least mostly about slavery. That yes, there might be other elements like states' rights, but it's mostly about slavery. And this kept European countries like Britain from getting involved and supporting the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation was important mostly for what it stood for, more so than what it actually practically did. All right, moving on into the summer of 1863, you have the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, this was a big turning point because even though it was a Confederate victory in Virginia, Lee's best general, Stonewall Jackson, was killed during this battle. Okay, this was really big because after this, since there was that confidence of the Confederacy after winning this battle, Lee decided to try to end the war quickly by invading the North at Gettysburg, which you probably heard about, we'll talk about in a second. And Lee also decided that he couldn't afford to send additional troops to Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was currently under Union siege and badly needed backup. All right, so with the death of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee said, we need to finish this war quickly. I've lost my best general. No, Vicksburg, you can't have additional troops. I need all of them so we can invade Pennsylvania. Okay, so he decided to invade the North to attempt to end this war swiftly since he no longer had his best general. Now, the Battle of Vicksburg. Okay, first of all, there was a siege around Vicksburg. We remember what a siege is. Okay, that is when you surround a city and cut off all food. All right, if you look at the top map there, that is the campaign for Vicksburg, Mississippi. You see Jackson right here. Okay, Brandon would be around right here, and this is Vicksburg. All right. So after a very lengthy siege by the Union, led by Grant, where food was completely cut off from the city of Vicksburg and people had to resort to eating rats because there was absolutely no food whatsoever, Then they were weakened, the Union attacked, and the Union won this victory. Okay, so this was really, really important. Um, this was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy because it could not be moved. For 2 years, the Union had tried to capture Vicksburg because it was such an important place on the Mississippi River. Now, the two most important modes of transportation were rivers and railroads, and whoever controlled the rivers and railroads would win the war. Okay, now the Mississippi River cut the Confederacy in half. So with this, the Union gained control of the Mississippi River, which meant they could freely sail up and down it, but no Confederate troops could go across, and nothing could get transported along that river for the Confederacy. So this was really, really important battle in Vicksburg, just 1 hour down I-20. And then, of course, came the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this was the largest, bloodiest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. This entire half of the globe there has not seen a bloodier battle than the Battle of Gettysburg. It took place in Pennsylvania. It's a great battlefield. If you ever visit Pennsylvania, make that a priority. See Gettysburg. This was a 3-day battle, bloodiest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The North won decisively on the third day, and the South was permanently pushed back. Okay, this is seen as the point when the war completely shifted. Okay, and the momentum shifted to the North instead of with the South. Okay, so at this point, it became clear that it was only a matter of time before the Union would indeed win this war. The only question was when. But the war did not stop after that. It kept going on for about 2 more years, just a couple major battles to cover, and then we'll get to the end of the war. You have the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864. This was also in Virginia. Neither side won decisively, and about 28,000 people were killed or wounded. I mean, that's just insane to have that many people killed or wounded, and then nobody wins. I mean, what is the point even? So that really shows how bloody and chaotic and ridiculous the war had gotten to where really neither side decisively won that battle. And then came Sherman's march to the sea. There was a Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman, and he said that we need to march all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, to Savannah, Georgia, and burn and destroy everything in our path. He said the lifeblood of the Confederacy is the citizens, the people, not the actual soldiers, but the people. So he said we need to bring this war into their living rooms, into their front lawns, and make them hurt the way that they've made us hurt, is basically how he put it. So he and his army marched from Atlanta, once they captured it, to Savannah and burned and destroyed everything and everyone in their path, killed a lot of people in doing that. What he would do is whenever he got to a railroad, he would have his men pick up the railroad ties and bend them around trees. That way, Confederate trains would not be able to run down the tracks anymore and transport troops and supplies. All right, so this was a very destructive march to the sea. And once they got here to the Atlantic Ocean, they then turned north to South Carolina and then to North Carolina and began to surround the Southern troops in Virginia, which would eventually lead to the end of the war. Okay, so the Civil War ended in April of 1865. You have Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Okay, very dramatic scene in U.S. history. And President Lincoln insisted that the terms for the end of the Civil War would include 2 things. It had to include 2 things, he told Grant. Otherwise, we cannot accept their surrender. He said, first, the readmission of the southern states back into the Union. Okay, we can't remain 2 separate countries and just stop fighting. No, he said, we have to become one country again. And 2, the abolition of slavery in all states. Now, this was still in question. Some Southerners said that, okay, it stinks that we lost this war, but we'll still get to keep our slaves, right? Lincoln said, no, absolutely not. He said, we have to insist upon these 2 things to reconstruct our country. We all have to be unified again, and slavery cannot be a thing anymore. Lee agreed to these terms, because remember, he didn't like slavery in the first place, and this is why the U.S. was preserved and slavery was abolished. Now, this war was the first event in U.S. history that was thoroughly documented by photographs, and this really ensured the impact of the war as well, because people got to see firsthand all of the carnage. More Americans died in the Civil War than died in every other war the U.S. has fought in combined. Okay, so we're talking all U.S. casualties from World War I, World War II, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., etc. All of the American deaths in those wars combined is still less than the number of Americans who died in the 4 years of the American Civil War. Now, in addition to the abolition of slavery, which was obviously probably the biggest accomplishment of the Civil War also permanently unified our country. People before the Civil War would refer to the United States as something that's plural. They would say the United States are instead of saying the United States is. And after the war, people started to say the United States is because they started to see it as one singular place instead of a bunch of plural places. And the Civil War really created the nation that the United States is today. Without a doubt, it was the turning point in our history as a country.